Okay, I want to continue with Chapter 12, Preliminary Investigations. How do we respond to calls of domestic violence? How do we handle those situations where there's been an assault occurred? Obviously, when we arrive, we park down the street, and then we look at, in domestic violence cases, obviously there's going to be possibly marks on both the suspect and the victim. So we have to try to determine through investigation and speaking with both of the parties what their involvement, who was the aggressor in this type of case or scenario. And sometimes it's very difficult to determine who the aggressor was in a domestic violence case because he hit her, she hit him back. What do we do? So we need to determine who did that and arrest. In Cumberland County, we only arrest one party. We're a single party arrestee. In Perry County, I saw a domestic violence case where my neighbors were involved in a melee and beating each other up, and they ended up arresting both of them. So obviously there was no criminal prosecution because neither one of them would testify against the other. So that was over. The patrol officer will be called a lot of times to, we talked about homicide scenes, but a death investigation. Obviously not everybody is killed, but we have to look at what are some of the signs of, was it suicide? Was it a natural death? Sometimes we're just not going to know. Was there a suicide note? We need to identify the victim. We need to speculate on a cause of death. Is there part-time I work for the Perry County Coroner's Office, so we look at deaths every day. In East Penn, we had 3 deaths last week where nobody was over 45 years of age, and they all turned out to be natural deaths. One had a medical condition that we knew was not fatal. Turned out it was fatal. We had a 39-year-old guy who drank himself to death, and that's very unusual, no medical conditions. We had another guy who was 46 who drank himself to death. So, a lot of times we won't know what's going on until we post a person for autopsy. So we need to speculate on causes of death. Was it a hanging? Was it autoerotic asphyxiation? Was it a medical condition? Sometimes we just don't know. Does the person take any medications? When's the last time the person was at the hospital? Does the person have a doctor? Are you able to call that doctor and say, hey, I got Bill Smith here dead. He's 38 years old. What can you tell me about it? So we need to treat all deaths as if they're suspicious, but we won't know until we get there to the scene and handle the situation and ask questions. When were they last seen? Was there newspapers in the mailbox? Was there mail there? I can try to determine how long they've been deceased. My neighbor, every morning, he's 70-year-old drunk, but every morning when I walk the kids to the school bus, I see him in the window reading a newspaper. He reads the newspaper. He's told me numerous times from front to back. The neighbor girl came to me on the other side of me and said, hey, Bob hasn't picked up his mail or his newspapers in 3 days. We need to check on him. Talking to him, I knew that he had just bought a firearm. His son was actually a police officer, but still, and I knew him very, very, very well, but I still just wasn't going to walk into his home. So I contacted the police department. They came down. It's a one-man police department. So him and I entered a residence. Again, need to be cautious when we're doing that. Again, we're entering someone's home and people have a right to protect themselves when entering a residence. Could they have shot at police? So we walked around. We quickly went to the living room and dining room area, because remember, most firearms are probably kept in the bedroom. So we obviously went to the kitchen and dining room area first, and we found him deceased on the floor from an obvious cardiac arrest, and he'd been down probably 3 days because he started to smell. So, we needed to determine what caused that death. The coroner came down and determined it to be a natural death. I made notification to his son, who I knew very well was a police officer. He was actually being deployed to Iraq. So, when you get to the scene, look for those characteristics. One guy put all of his stuff out, his life insurance policy, his checkbook, his driver's license, and he left a 6-page note before going out back and hanging himself. So, a lot of times you will see suicide notes. People think it's uncommon. It happens. I can't remember the last time I went to a suicide scene and there wasn't some type of suicide note. We had a gentleman hanging 2 weeks ago. There was kind of some issues as to why he was hanging. And by the time we got him down and looked in his pockets, we found a 14-page suicide note. So we need to deal with those situations. You as a patrol officer will go to people all the time and dealing with attempted suicides, people who are thinking of killing themselves but are just crying for help. And you have to go to the hospital and sign out what we call 302 paperwork, which is an involuntary commitment, to where you write down on a piece of paper and sign it saying, Bill Smith told me he wanted to kill himself, and he told me how he was going to do it and things of that nature. So, and then the doctor or psychiatrist will treat him and can keep him involuntarily in the hospital for up to 72 hours, 3 days. And then they can go and get some court paperwork and hold the people longer. So that's stuff that you'll deal with a lot in the patrol situation. As I talked, people with mental health issues, we're dealing with people every day with mental health issues. Going and serving 302 warrants is certainly not an uncommon occurrence anymore. And it's getting very difficult because hospitals are saying, where do we put these people? We don't have any room. They're literally keeping them in the ER for 72 hours. I had a guy who we actually went in, found him hanging, cut him down. He was unconscious. We got him to the hospital. By the time we processed the scene and determined, what happened, and the wife came home, and we tried to explain to him what's going on. By the time we arrived at the emergency room, about an hour later, he was already discharged. And the doctor's justification was, well, he was suicidal at the time. He's not suicidal now when I talk to him, but he was suicidal an hour ago. It was just a way to kick people out the door. We had to go back to the scene because we did not, at that point, we thought we had 72 hours to take his guns or keep them for safekeeping until he was out of the hospital. We had to go back to the scene, and hopefully with the wife, we detained him again on a 302, and he ended up assaulting one of my officers. So we deal with attempted suicide calls all the time, almost daily, and suicide calls. The last thing I'm going to talk about, the crimes that we respond to that you need to be cognizant of and think about what you're doing, is the response to a sexual assault. How are you as a male police officer going to conduct an interview with a female victim. One of the ways is you got to have some empathy when talking to a female of sexual assault. If the female showed up at the hospital and is asking for a sexual assault kit, you normally won't interview the victim because the nurse is trained, a forensic nurse who's trained in forensic science, will collect your evidence for you as a patrol officer and an investigator. And that forensic nurse will conduct an interview, trying to ascertain who, what, where, when, why, and how. And they're trained professionals. And you'll get a packet of papers about that thick that talks about where they were, what they were wearing, was there anything found, who the potential suspects are, what happened, date, time. I mean, very thorough. So when you have to, if you have to interview the victim, your interview will be very limited to what you don't know. And really, I don't think I've ever had one where I had to go re-interview the victim, unless the victim was not telling the truth, but very rarely. So the easiest way to do that is you got to build a rapport with the victim. Hey, I understand this is a difficult situation for you. Please try to tell me what you can. And you don't need all the gory details at that point, but a preliminary interview is conducted to try to get as much information as you can, so that you can go back and collect forensic evidence, so that you can go back and get information on the suspect. So those are some things that are important when conducting a sexual assault interview. If it's during the day, have a girl from the YMCA. The YMCA has a rape crisis hotline. You can call them. Wonderful, fantastic people. They'll come over and they'll conduct an interview with the victim and help you do that interview. Remember, when you're interviewing a victim, you're in essence reassaulting the victim. Okay? And you don't want to do that. You don't want to keep asking the victim, well, how long was the sexual intercourse? Well, how long was this? Well, you said it was 3 minutes. Now, last time you said it was 2 minutes. Those are some of the issues with doing sexual assault interviews. They do need to be thorough, but on the other hand, you want to keep the mental health aspect of being a victim of sexual assault to a minimum. So just remember, when you go to the scene and people are victims, I was a victim of a burglary in my house while I was at work. I don't know if in my earlier lectures I talked about it, but it was difficult for my wife because we were the victim of a burglary. On a side note, it was a funny story. So I was working night shift in Shippensburg. My wife calls me at 5:30 in the morning, says that we've been burglarized. Yeah, I said, how the hell do you know that? She said, because our TV's gone, your motorcycle helmets are gone, and there's stuff taken from the house. Oh, shit. Excuse me. Oh, crap. I drove home where I find 5 police officers in my kitchen. I thought, wow, what a fantastic response by the Carlisle police. They actually already had the subject in custody at that time. So my wife, being in a state of shock, she's like, oh my gosh, honey, there's 5 police officers here. They've been fantastic. So I said, do you have any idea why there's 5 cops here at the house? And she's like, no. I said, because you're standing there in a white see-through shirt in your underwear. And she was 24 at the time. I can assure you that that's probably one of the reasons there were 5 cops standing in the house. But we laugh and joke about it, that she got a fantastic response from the police department. In fact, all the police officers responded. So I can imagine how that call went out. Hey, you got to come up here. and see this victim. I don't think she realized she's standing in here in a white t-shirt and her underwear. So we laugh about it 20 years later. But at the time, it was very difficult being the victim of a burglary. You know, I'm at work, my wife's home alone. What's to keep people from coming in the house and harming her while I'm at work? You know, you have to be cognizant when responding to these calls that you have the victim's feelings and thoughts in your minds before you do that. That's the end of Chapter 12, Preliminary Investigations. Next week, we're going to talk about report writing, and then we're just about ready to wrap it up for the semester. So hang in there, get your work completed, and have a great day.